Stephen. He completed the city's first development charges study for us. The reason for the presentation this evening is to present a new development charges study, as our bylaw is set to expire in April of this year. Development charges is a primary way for municipalities to recover or raise funds for growth-related capital expenditures from new development, and are based on the methodology that existing taxpayers not be responsible for capital costs for new growth. So this presentation is to inform council of the new DC calculation and regulating changes prior to posting the study to the city's website.
If I may, before you start, council, if you would wait till after the presentation to ask questions, please. Thank you.
Right, jump ahead of that one. I think you covered most of that. No problem. So as was mentioned, development charges are in place under the authority of the Development Charges Act. The purpose of them are to cover or to recover the capital costs of new residential and non-residential development within a municipality. And when we're looking at those capital costs, those are the broader growth-related costs of the municipality that would be in addition to the local service costs of new development, such as internal roads and water and sewer mains. That would be a direct funding responsibility as a condition of development. As you're most likely aware, there have been a number of changes to the Development Charges Act recently through Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act, and as I move through the presentation, I will highlight where those changes have occurred and the implications of those on the city's background study and proposed bylaw. Just to go over briefly the study process that we followed in preparing the draft findings of the background study. We started out in late summer, September of last year, going through detailed discussions with city staff around the anticipated development within the city, as well as what the growth-related needs would be to service new development. Then proceeding to presenting draft findings today to council before moving through the remainder of the statutory and non-statutory public process. So the background study and draft bylaw do need to be available on the city's website at least 60 days. It'll be available by the 26th of this month. There will then be a non-statutory additional stakeholder consultation meeting, which is being scheduled for early in February, before proceeding to a statutory public meeting under the Act on February 27th, before the bylaw will be considered for passage by City Council prior to the expiry date of April 10th, which is the date that the new bylaw is proposed to come into effect. So under the Development Charges Act, there is a detailed methodology that's prescribed in terms of how development charges are calculated. And so on the screen now is a simplified illustration of that. And so the exercise begins with understanding what the anticipated development is within a municipality, looking at the amount, type, and location of residential and non-residential growth. And then based on that anticipated development, there needs to be an assessment of what is the increase in need for service and what are those capital costs that would be required to provide that increase in service need. In looking at those capital costs and need for service, there's a couple tests that need to be met. The Development Charges Act defines certain services that are eligible to be recovered from development charges through the bylaw. And as well, you also have to have regard for the average level of service that was in place over the past 15 years in a municipality, that 15-year period being one of the changes from Bill 23, where it previously was a 10-year historical period assessment. And the purpose of that test is to make sure that the level of service that is being recovered from new development is not greater than the average level of service that was in place previously, and now in this case now a 15-year period, so that you're not increasing levels of service on the backs of new development through development charges. Once those capital costs have been determined, there's then a few deductions that are required under the Act. Most notably, if there's any grants, subsidies, or other contributions towards those costs that are anticipated, those need to be deducted, as they shouldn't also be recovered from new development. And then as well, if there is any benefit to existing development of those capital needs, those costs should also be deducted. And so a typical example of that would be is if you are replacing an existing facility with a larger facility, the share of the new construction that relates to replacing the existing space is a benefit to existing development and would not be recovered through development charges. Once we've arrived at the net growth related costs, then those costs are apportioned over the same development that we looked at in commencing this assessment to then arrive at a charge that's typically imposed per residential dwelling unit or per square foot of non-residential development area. So the growth forecast that's been prepared for the purpose of this exercise has been based on the ongoing comprehensive review that's been undertaken for the city, and it looks at growth from the 2023 period to 2036 being the current official plan horizon. And so over that 13-year forecast period, that would see the city growing by just under 4,900 persons, and that would, over that period, require the development of about 175 residential dwelling units per year. And in terms of non-residential growth, a little bit of a higher growth rate in terms of annual employment growth of about 3,600 jobs over that period, resulting in about 4.7 million additional square feet of gross floor area development, with about 40% of that employment growth being in the industrial sector and about 60% in the commercial and institutional sectors. So the services that were looked at in terms of those services that are eligible under the Development Charges Act were looked at over either a 10 or 13-year period. Transit services are assessed over a 10-year period because that is the forecast limitation under the Development Charges Act, while all other services can be assessed over a longer term period. And as such, the services related to a highway, which includes roads and related infrastructure, as well as public works facilities and vehicles, fire protection, parks and recreation, library, ambulance, and waste diversion were assessed over that longer term period across the city. And then water and wastewater services, again, assessed over that longer term period, but only in those areas of the city that would be serviced by water and wastewater. One of the changes from Bill 23 was that housing services was previously an eligible service. It is no longer eligible for inclusion in development charge background studies. So across those service areas that were assessed, the total gross capital cost for the increase in need for services, you can see, is about just under $200 million over that 13-year forecast period. There's a number of deductions, as I mentioned, that have been made. The most significant one, about $106 million, about 53% of those total costs, is deducted as a benefit to existing development. Where we see some of those benefit to existing developments occur is around road projects, the municipal works yard redevelopment, and the replacement of existing facilities. We look at the other notable deductions. There's other deductions in the top blue section of the pie chart. About 9% of the cost, or $18 million. Those other deductions refer to the funding share of ambulance needs that would be funded by the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry, as well as other Transport Canada and CN funding towards some of the roads and related projects. The grants and other subsidies represent about $23 million, or 12% of the total cost, and the majority of those are related to anticipated grant funding towards the Brookdale CN Connect Link project. And there's a couple other minor deductions around the post-period benefit deduction, which is growth-related costs that are of a benefit to growth beyond the period of 2036. And then you'll see a deduction of $2 million for the development charge reserve funds. Those are development charges that have already been collected, that have not yet been spent, and so are available to fund the needs that have been identified through this background study, and so they are deducted, so they're not collected again from new development. So after looking at those deductions, about 23% of the total gross capital costs are included in the calculation of the charge, about $46.5 million. So in looking at how that growth-related cost of $46.5 million breaks down by service area, you can see about 77% of the costs relate to the services related to highway, water, and wastewater, those hard infrastructure costs, which is fairly typical across municipalities where we do see the majority of those growth-related infrastructure costs residing in those three service areas. The other areas where there are some notable cost inclusions are for parks and recreation and fire services, about 12% and 7% of the total development charge recoverable costs. So the detailed development charge background studies will be available on the city's website on the 26th. It will include the detailed listing of projects, but to give council an indication of some of the main projects by service area that are contributing to that growth-related, that total growth-related cost of just over $46 million. By service area, those include a new station, replacing Station 1 for fire protection, which represents about $3.4 million of the growth-related costs. Within services related to a highway, there's a number of road upgrades, widenings, and extensions, which represent about $23 million of the development charge recoverable costs. Within transit services, this is a service that wasn't included in your prior background study. And the growth-related costs that wouldn't be funded by provincial and federal grants represents about $160,000. The city's share of ambulance services, so looking at additional ambulances, paramedic equipment, and facility space, would be about $463,000. Within parks and recreation, so three of the main projects contributing to that overall development charge recoverable cost for parks and recreation, which represented about $5.4 million in total, were for an artificial turf field, $1.5 million in growth-related costs. The share of the waterfront plan implementation over that forecast period would be funded about $1.4 million from development charges. And then parkland development, being the development of new parkland that is received by the city through the development approvals process, would represent about $1.4 million. Within wastewater, there's about $1.1 million in growth-related costs for the share of the combined sewer separation program over that period, and then future growth-related water mains that would be required as new development occurs represents about $5.7 million. So based on that anticipated development and the total growth-related cost, the schedule of charges has been calculated. And so I recognize it's a little bit hard to see on the screen here, but what's shown is the charge by service area, as well as by dwelling unit type and per square foot of non-residential gross floor area. And so the structure of the charge is consistent with the current development charges that are in place in the city, where the charge is imposed for residential dwelling units for single and semi-detached dwellings, for apartments of 2 bedrooms and greater, or 1 bedroom and bachelor, and then for other multiples, and as well as for special care dwelling units. The current charge within the city in the fully serviced area for a single and semi-detached dwelling unit is $7,608. The fully calculated charge would increase by about 83%, and it's $13,931, an increase of just over $6,300 per dwelling unit. The charge then decreases by dwelling unit type based on the occupancy assumptions for each dwelling unit from census data. And so single and semi-detached dwelling units having the highest occupancy assumption have the highest charge, while you'd see a lower charge for apartments of bachelor and 1 bedroom, which have a calculated charge of $7,099. Then on the bottom of the table, then there's a comparison of the current charge to the fully calculated charge in the fully serviced area. And what you'll note here on line number 2 is the calculated charge, and then on line number 4, where it says urban area year 1 20% reduction, That is because under Bill 23, there's a requirement that under the first year of any new bylaws, only 80% of the charge can be imposed, and then that decrease gets phased in over the next 4 years of the bylaw, and I'll speak to that a little bit further. And so, with the fully calculated charge being about an 83% increase for single and semi-detached dwelling units, the charge in the first year of the bylaw would only be a 46% increase when witnessing the statutory 20% reduction to the charge. And focusing on the single and semi-detached dwelling units at the moment, because those units do represent about 60% of the anticipated development in the city over the next 13 years. As you move across the comparison, you will note that the percentage increase does differ by dwelling unit type, where we see a much higher increase for apartments of 1-bedroom and bachelors. And the reason for that is changes in the occupancy assumptions between census periods. And so the 2018 study was actually based on 2011 census data, where now we have the benefit of 2021 census data, which gives a different occupancy profile for the dwelling units by residential type. And lastly, for non-residential development, you'll see that the fully calculated charge actually goes down by about 5 cents per square foot, or about 1% decrease. And in the first year of the bylaw, because the reduction to the charge does apply to the total charge and to both residential and non-residential development, there'd actually be a 21% decrease in the non-residential charge during the first year of the bylaw. So then when looking at development charges, one of the many factors impacting development activity in a municipality, I want to look at how the development charge policies within the city compare to those in surrounding municipalities. And so on this bar graph, it includes not only the lower tier area municipal development charges, which are represented in the dark blue section, then it also includes in the red section of the bars either the water and wastewater component of development charges, or the water and wastewater charges that are imposed under the authority of the Municipal Act, which is used in some of the surrounding municipalities to recover similar costs that are included under the development charge bylaw. And then in the yellow section of the bars are upper tier development charges where applicable, and the green section is where there are education development charges to give that full spectrum of the development charges payable by municipality. And so with the 83% increase in the fully calculated charge, or the 46% increase in the year one charge, we would see that the position of the city increased from being above only that of North Glengarry when compared to the other municipalities in the United Counties, to moving above that of the other municipalities other than North Dundas. And what you'll notice is the 3 municipalities just to the left of the city's current position, indicated by the dark gray arrow, being South Glengarry, North Stormont, and South Dundas. Those municipalities not currently have development charges. So then, to understand the impact a little bit further of development charges on non-residential home prices and development activity, what we looked at was the share of the average price of new home sales that development charges represent for the same comparator municipalities. And so as you can see here on this illustration, the average sale price of a new home in 2022 was the lowest in Cornwall in comparison to the other comparator municipalities, with the average sales price of a new single or semi-detached home being $551,000 in the city in 2022, with development charges representing about 1.4% of that total sales price. When we look at the increase to the fully calculated charge, not even just the charge in year one, but to that fully calculated charge of just under $14,000, the share, if that cost did get passed on to home buyers in terms of increased home sales, that would increase the share of that total sale price from about 1.4% to 3%. And 3% is actually the average share of the sales price that development charges or connection charges represent across all of the comparative municipalities. So placing the city exactly within that average range of the composition of the total sales price that the development charges or connection charges do represent. And then further to that as well, with that increase in the fully calculated charge of just over $6,300, if that additional cost truly couldn't get passed or couldn't get absorbed in terms of land prices, developer margins, input costs, and truly was passed on to the home buyer, that cost would represent about a $33 increase in a monthly mortgage price, so fairly nominal in terms of the overall impact on home buyers. Then quickly just looking at two further comparisons for non-residential development. As we saw on the earlier slide, the non-residential charge is decreasing by 1% for the fully calculated charge, or 21% in year one of the charge. And so we can see that the position of the city relative to other municipalities would remain unchanged. And what's shown here is the charge, the grouping of arrows are for the development charge that will be imposed across the city, while the grouping of arrows to the left are for the charges that would be imposed in the Brookdale North corridor, as they would also have the area-specific development charge imposed there, that charge not being subject to review at this time. And then on the following slide, we see a similar comparison for industrial development in terms of where the city ranks relative to the comparative municipalities, with there being a number of municipalities further to the right at the lower end of the comparison who do have industrial exemption policies. So having understood the calculation of the charge and the impact of that charge on the relative competitiveness of the city, there's then a number of policies that govern the implementation of that charge. A number of those policies being dictated by legislation, some others being at the discretion of council through the bylaw policies. So firstly, development charges are calculated and payable at the time a building permit is issued, or they can also be collected at subdivision registration for hard services. Municipalities, through agreement, always have the ability to enter into agreements to allow for the charges to be paid before or after they otherwise would be payable. And the city's current policy within their current bylaw is for the charges to be paid at building permit issuance. There's a couple caveats to that that came into force in 2020 under the changes to the act that were made at that time. And that's for any developments that proceed through site plan or zoning bylaw amendment approvals under the Planning Act. Their charges are calculated when those planning applications are made and then held frozen at that rate until building permit issuance, as long as that permit is issued within 2 years of the approval of the application. There are also, as I mentioned, there's the ability for council to enter into agreements to allow for charges to be paid after they otherwise would be payable. There's also 2 instances in which there are statutory deferred payments in installments that must be witnessed. Those are for rental housing and institutional developments, where these developments are required to pay their charges in 6 equal annual payments commencing from the date of occupancy. And municipalities are allowed to charge interest on those installment payments, as well as the charges calculated earlier in the approvals process at planning application. There's now a maximum rate that is included in the Development Charges Act through Bill 23, which is the average prime rate plus 1%. This represents a slight decrease from the city's current interest rate policy, which was to charge the prime rate plus 3%. And so going forward, or as of November 28th of last year, when Bill 23 received royal assent, the maximum interest rate is as defined in the Act, the average rate plus 1%. So then in terms of exemptions to the payment of development charges, municipalities don't have the ability to waive charges on a case-by-case basis, but they can define specific situations in which development charges would be exempt. And there are also other situations that are defined in the Development Charges Act, for which those statutory exemptions must be witnessed. In terms of the types of non-statutory exemptions that council can include in their bylaw, they typically are structured around a type of use, so that would be something like places of worship or farm buildings, a specific geographic area or development type, or for a specific service. What the Act is specific about, though, is that where there are any exemptions, whether those are statutorily required or non-statutorily required and included in the bylaw, those exemptions do represent a loss in revenue to the municipality, and that loss in revenue does need to be made up through taxes or rates or other non-development charge sources, and cannot be passed on to other stages of new development through higher development charges. And so the city has been, through the implementation of the prior bylaw, maintaining that practice of funding that lost revenue of development charge exemptions. So the statutory exemptions that are required in the bylaw are that development charges aren't imposed for upper or lower tier governments or school boards. Any development of lands that are intended for use by a university that received operating funds from the government are also exempt. For any existing industrial buildings, they may expand up to 50% of their existing gross floor area without the payment of development charges. Any expansions beyond that 50%, they would pay development charges on that share of the development. And there are also statutory exemptions for additional residential units, whether those are provided through the intensification of existing buildings or in purpose-built new residential buildings. And so these exemptions were generally provided already under the Act, but they were revised slightly through Bill 23. And so what these exemptions include is that for any existing or new residential buildings that are either single detached, semi-detached, or row houses, they may add up to one or up to 2 additional units. One of those can be contained in an ancillary structure. And then for any existing rental residential buildings, they can add up to 1 additional unit or 1% of the total units in the building, whichever is greater, without the payment of development charges. So further statutory exemptions that were added through Bill 23 largely focused on affordable housing. And so nonprofit housing, which was previously one of the types of development that required a mandatory installment payment, has now been made fully exempt under the Act. Any inclusionary zoning affordable units are also now exempt. And then there are additional exemptions that have been included for affordable or attainable ownership or rental units. However, these exemptions are not quite yet in effect. They will be in effect upon proclamation of the Lieutenant Governor. There is still a bulletin that is required to be released that will help define the affordability criteria for these units. How they're currently defined in the Act is that units that are under 80% of the average purchase price or average market rent would be affordable rental or ownership units and exempt. However, the exact definition of how that 80% will be determined hasn't yet been released to this bulletin, and so these exemptions aren't quite yet into effect. But once that proclamation occurs, they will be enforced at that time. There's also some further reductions to the charge that are now statutorily in effect. So for any rental housing development, there'll be deductions by number of bedrooms. So if there's greater than 2 bedrooms, there'll be a 25% discount, 2-bedroom unit, a 20% discount, and then for a 1-bedroom or bachelor rental unit, there would be a 15% discount. And then, as I mentioned, there's now also a mandatory reduction of the development charge. And so during the first year of a bylaw, a maximum of 80% of the charge will be imposed, 85% the second year, then 90%, 95%, with the full charge being able to be imposed during the 5th year of the bylaw and the remaining years of the bylaw, with development charge bylaws now having a maximum life of 10 years, that being increased from 5 years under Bill 23 as well. So the proposed non-statutory exemptions in comparison to the current non-statutory exemptions are for bona fide farm uses, places of worship, and hospitals, all currently exempt under your citywide development charge bylaw. College or university buildings, that exemption would be removed as it's now statutorily required under the Act. Manufacturing uses are currently exempt. That's being proposed to be removed by staff in the new bylaw. And then infill development within the priority area, the heart of the city CIP area, is also proposed to continue to be exempt from the payment of development charges. So a couple remaining policies to identify. One is that redevelopment credits continue to be included in the bylaw for demolitions or conversions of existing buildings or structures. And so the intention of the redevelopment credits are to reflect that where there is an existing use that is being converted to another use or demolished and replaced, the replacement of the existing use does not represent an increase in need for service, and therefore no development charges should be payable. So if you knock down a single family home and replace it with a new one, the credit would offset the development charge payable, and there would be no development charges in that case. But if you replace a single family home with a larger townhouse block, you would pay the difference between the development charges for the single family home and the larger townhouse block that's been created, as an example. One change to the existing redevelopment credit policy is that the redevelopment of any buildings that are listed on the city's vacant building registry would not be eligible for redevelopment credits. And so lastly, with indexing, the Act does allow for the charge to be adjusted annually to reflect the underlying changes in costs, and therefore reducing those cash flow implications between bylaw reviews and allowing the charge to keep pace with the underlying increase in the cost for the needs that underlie that charge. That indexing of the charge in the bylaw can be either mandatory or discretionary, where it needs to be presented to council for approval annually. The current policy is for that charge to be indexed annually on January 1st. It's proposed that the indexing would continue to occur on a mandatory basis, but that timing would move to the anniversary date of the bylaw, so that the indexing provision is on the same date as the change in the charge with the 5-year phase, and so the charge is only changing once annually for ease of administration and communication to the development industry. So in terms of next steps, as I mentioned with the study process at the outset, commencing from here, the study will be released on the city's website, proceeding through to the consultation period. And to the extent there are any changes required to the background study or draft bylaw, further amendments can be made to those documents prior to the passage of the bylaw, which again is anticipated for March 27th.
Questions from council, please? Any questions? Seeing none?
Yeah, I got another.
Huh?
Hang on.
Yep.
Wait, wait.
Councillor McIntosh.
Yeah, I want to touch on the population guesstimates. We've had a series of, over the years, of people trying to guess what the population is going to be in its number of years. Anywhere from 80,000, population 80,000 by a certain date, and to 50,000. How certain are you of these figures when you say we can grow to 53,450 in 13 years? I'm just trying what your math is on this one. How do you calculate? Because I've seen it's been all over the map in recent years.
Yeah, so it's been prepared as part of the broader municipal comprehensive review that's been undertaken for the city to look at the growth trends in the city, and so that's being prepared, based looking at a number of factors. Some of those including historical growth trends, so looking at the growth in the city in the recent period, which has been a much higher pace of development, as well as the trends in the broader area, which is informed somewhat by the work that's being done for the United Counties of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry in terms of their official plans, looking at the market demands for new housing in the surrounding area, as well as the population projections that are provided by the Ministry of Finance as well. So I think what's important to note, though, is that while there's obviously no certainty around whether those numbers get achieved in terms of the growth occurring at that time horizon, what we have looked at, which is quite important to the development charges methodology, is that there's alignment between the increase in need for service and the increment of growth that's being looked at. So if growth accelerates, then that would presumably mean that those needs that are being identified would accelerate as well. If that growth does not occur at that same time horizon, then what that would mean is the city would collect less development charges, but also presumably the needs that are identified in the study would also be deferred, because you're not going to need the same infrastructure if development doesn't occur at the same pace. So ultimately what you're getting is a rate of infrastructure for an increment of development.
So I'll move on to the increase in need for services. Do I understand this right, that if population grows to a certain number, say 53,000, there's going to be a need for better transit service, fire protection services, paramedic services? Is that what, am I reading here?
Yeah, so what's been identified here is the needs for the services you're already providing that would increase with new development. So for example, with transit, what's been identified in the city's transit master plan is a projection of additional vehicles and ridership that would be achieved. Obviously a share of that is going to be from gaining further ridership from existing residents, as well as a higher modal share from new residents as well.
Yeah, I can certainly see when it comes to health services and the paramedic services, where population grows, demand on their services grows. I'm just wondering, like fire services, many years ago they did a study, it wasn't your firm, and the consensus was that if we went to 80,000, we still had enough, our services would not have to grow, because we have right now in place, police, fire, etc., could cover 80,000. Is that, you wouldn't agree with that one, would you?
That's not the that's not what's been communicated by the city in terms of the demand for services and what would be required with growth, not only in population and employment, but I think also notably with fire services, with additional development area as well, because that service is driven not only by population but also by coverage area.
Yeah. I know police service is not involved in this.
So police services was a service that we consulted with the city. At this time, there was no concrete identification of what would be required in terms of any additional capital needs for new development. So to the extent that I think that's something the city is continuing to investigate, once that is, if and when that is known, then that would be potentially included in the bylaw at that time.
Okay, thanks.
Councilor Good.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Mayor. Through you, thank you for the presentation. I just have some questions in regards to the implications of Bill 23 and how that's changed the way that we're collecting development charges. I understood, at least I thought I understood, that we were no longer able to collect development charges from residential development. But as I'm reading this and we're looking at that, I assume that I've misunderstood that. Could you provide some clarification around that?
Sure. So development charges continue to be applicable to residential and non-residential development, but there are, with Bill 23, there are a number of policies that have been put in place that restrict the amount you could collect. So one of them is the phase-in of the charge, where for all development, not just residential development, you can only collect 80% of the charge in year 1, 85% year 2, and so forth. So that represents a loss of revenue in each of those years. There are other types of residential development that will be exempt that weren't statutorily exempt previously. So for example, affordable housing and attainable housing are now exempt or are now identified as being exempt. That'll be in effect once proclaimed. So that's one area of residential development that would be, you would no longer collect for. There's the additional residential units in existing and new residential buildings, which were largely exempt before, but that's been expanded slightly for the medium and high density building types. And then as well the reductions for rental housing. But if you were to think about the types of low density development that isn't meeting those affordability thresholds, development charges would continue to be imposed as before on those types of development, subject to the statutory reduction in the charge.
Perfect. So like a regular suburb would be charged the same amount. Do you have any numbers around the potential, like the lost revenue that we would see as a result of the changes?
I don't have it offhand at the moment, but so if we're looking at $46 million of being roughly the need over the 13 year period, and so that representing I guess a little over $3 million annually. So in year one with a 20% reduction, you'd be looking at about a $600,000 shortfall in the first year of the bylaw.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for asking that question, because I was almost of the same mind as you. I'd been told that we were losing them too, so thanks for asking that question. Councillor McDonald, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The passage on page 19 here, I don't know what slide it would be there, of the simplified DCA methodology calculation. So I see here the increase in need for service must not exceed the average historical level of service over the prior 15-year period. And I'm just wondering how reasonable that is. Does that take in effect market increases or fluctuations beyond what's been average in the past? Or if it does, it just means we would have to absorb any difference, or?
Yeah, so without getting too technical, so what the Act asks or requires you to look at there is the infrastructure that was in place to provide services over that last 15-year period, and looking at that from what they call a quantitative and qualitative standpoint. So essentially, what was in place? So what square foot of facilities for fire facilities were in place and in service, and what would it cost you to replace those now? That being that qualitative measure. So that's what accounts for changes in cost over that 15-year period. Is if you have a certain size facility, what would it cost you in today's dollar to replicate that level of service and to build a facility? So so it does take into account the fact that things might have been purchased or built 15 years ago or further in the past for a much lower value, but it takes into account what the current replacement costs of those assets are.
Okay. And seems to me, I thought you mentioned that housing services were not included in the, and I immediately thought of social housing, but then I see that nonprofit housing developments are exempt from development charges.
Yeah, so nonprofit housing and affordable housing, a certain threshold will be exempt, but the services of actually providing municipal housing services, that was previously a cost that could have been recovered from development charges. That service is now ineligible, so those costs cannot be included.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Bailey. Oh, sorry, Mr. Uganda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you a few questions. Please, can you tell me if Bill 23 will allow us to promote development since development of the former industrial lands through the exemptions that you're talking about? Is it a way to promote the development of those lands?
So, if I'm understanding the question correctly, if you're talking about ways you can incentivize the development of city-owned industrial lands?
Yes.
Yeah, so Bill 23 doesn't really directly impact that, other than the charge has to be reduced by 20% during the first year of the bylaw, and then further lesser reductions over the next 4 years. So there's some incentive there. Other than that, I don't think there's anything in Bill 23 that would really impact that. Municipalities always have at their ability through their bylaw to exempt any type of development they do wish, should they want to exempt development of a certain type or a certain area.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you, I checked on the graphics, and I saw a difference between, like for example in page 57, I see education DC on Ottawa City, and no education DC on Kingston. Do you have any idea why? Because I know those two cities has universities, so why Kingston does not have any education DC?
Yeah, so the education DCs are school board development charges for the purchase of new land, so they're not related to the universities themselves.
Okay.
So it's related to the public and to the public school boards, and so not all school boards do have education development charges.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Any more questions? Councilor Bennett? No? Thank you very much, Mr. Stevens. I appreciate your coming in and at least education for us on DCs. I appreciate it. Ms. Bailey, thank you very much.
So now, Mr. Mayor, we are looking for a motion to receive this presentation.
Councilor McDonald, Councilor Hollingsworth, all in favor? Opposed? Seeing none.
And before our presenters leave the table, we're going to deal with the development charges background study update. And the recommendation there is that council receive this report and direct administration to proceed with next steps as legislated through the Development Charges Act 1997 and as outlined in the presentation.
Councilor McDonald, Councilor Good. All in favor? Okay.
And we have a second presentation this evening, and that is the Land Mobile Radio Upgrade. And here to present are Fire Chief Matthew Stevenson and Acting Inspector George Kazinovic from Cornwall Police Service.
Good evening, Acting Mayor Gardner, members of council. Acting Inspector Knezovic and I are here tonight to present this report, and the report you found in your package with a recommendation that council receive for information purposes. Council will recall last year Chief Weber and Acting Inspector Knezovic presented to council at their in-camera session on February 28th. The purpose was to allow the city's consultant Planet Works to present their findings on the radio analysis report. The recommendation that evening was to have council accept that report and to provide direction to staff to prepare documents for 2023's budget process. The purpose tonight is to provide council with a brief overview of the proposed project. As we do have new members of council that have been elected that weren't part of that presentation last year, we felt it prudent to provide council with this update. The purpose here tonight is simply to provide council with an overview. There's been a number of documents that have been provided. The intent here is not to provide any direction. This is a proposal, and we will be looking to take this to budget and present this in a format at the budget presentation in February. At this time, though, I will allow Acting Inspector Knezevic to provide a little bit more greater detail on the project. And I think it's important to note, this is, although the two of us are sitting before you tonight, this is a citywide project and encompasses municipal works, building and bylaw, transit, and many of the other departments that we have.
Thank you, Chief. Acting Mayor Gardner and councillors. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of the land mobile radio project. Includes an upgrade and replacement of the existing radio system, which is at the end of intended lifespan. This is an opportunity to replace our current antiquated radio communication systems and to potentially combine services to promote better overall coverage with the identified city departments of Cornwall Police, Cornwall Fire, City Transit, Municipal Works, which also includes roads, water and wastewater, parks and recreation. The goal of this project is to have a managed system that would comply with public safety industry standards while addressing the specific needs for each city stakeholders. A managed service would be responsible for maintaining and anticipating the needs of the city departments. The map that you see on the screen would be the proposed expanded coverage that the city of Cornwall would have with an integrated system while ensuring interoperability between all departments. In closing, this provides a supportable and reliable radio system which will fulfill the city's needs for the next 10 to 15 years. Supports public and employee safety and meets and exceeds public safety standards for performance and functionality.
Thank you, Acting Mayor. That is, again, just a brief overview of the intended proposal, and certainly happy to answer any questions.
That's to be brought to the next budget.
It is intended to be on the 2023 budget proposal for council's consideration.
Thank you. Any questions? Sarah, Miss
I
Councillor Good?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Acting Mayor. I would like to ask through you about, this is going to be used by various different departments. I have kind of heard some whispers that there might be a potential of exam.
So if they're expanded, like we provide already to fire services in the counties, so that would just expand to that area as well. So the capability, especially with technology today, a lot of it's on the internet, so it makes things a lot easier for it to flow. So to answer your question, the capability will be there with the new land mobile radio system.
Thank you.
Councillor McDonald?
Thank you, Mr. Acting Mayor. Through you. So to either of you gentlemen, whoever would like to respond. Regarding the interoperability, is this a question of communication among fire, police, public works, parks and rec, everybody who was named, or is it with the public and all those departments, or any of those departments? Is it like an internal system thing?
Through you, Acting Mayor, to Councilor McDonald. So the intended is it's not for the public. So this is for the interoperability within our city departments. So an opportunity for each department to utilize we'll call it the base work, and build on that. Whereas now a lot of our departments are siloed. So, you know, Public Works might be doing this, and so this is just now one blanket that will cover all departments.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Hollingsworth?
Thank you, Mr. Acting Mayor. Just one quick question. You mentioned something about the counties being able to communicate with the counties with this new system. Did I understand that correctly?
So right now, we dispatch for county fires. We have 4 counties that we provide a ready service, and that's including through our computer system and the radio systems. They have a system they have to plug into ours, so it would just boast what we have right now, and that we could still continue on working with our city city, which is fire, police, and city employees, but their system can still connect with ours, so that's the interoperability.
Do we charge them for that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilor McIntosh?
I'm always the bottom line guy. That's what I mean.
Budget's coming.
Just question to George, I guess. When it comes to officer safety, how important is this to upgrade this system? What I'm thinking of, if a police officer finds himself outside the city for whatever reason, is the communication still pretty good?
We, depends how far we would be out of the city. We have our patrol zones and the areas that we would be patrolling. This system right now would, not to get too much into the specifics of the inadequacies, but it would definitely boost our signal to provide that reach to those officers.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm trying to say, there must be situations where an officer finds himself maybe in St. Andrews with a stop. Would the system still work? I guess, is it a dead zone?
With the truncated system that was recommended by the consultant, our reach would be much farther and there would not be any breakage of the radio transmissions between the officer and dispatch.
Okay. The 3.1 million, where did that number come from?
Through you, Acting Mayor Gardner, to Councillor McIntosh. So the original, in the original document, we had highlighted around 3.3. We're looking at, now we really won't know, this is again ballpark, we really won't know until we go through an actual tender process. This is really to highlight the magnitude of the project and where we're expecting that to come in.
Yeah. And we would borrow the money for that.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Councilor Ugundo?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much for this presentation. I have a few questions. We are talking about something very sensitive about the security of our community and our residents. And I think we have to be very accurate about the decision that we are taking. So that's why I would like to ask you, in case this system fell down, do we have a plan B?
I've never seen a response like that before. That's great.
That's fine. Yes, we do have, the system that we have right now, there's a backup system. And what would happen is, either if it's a site and we would have to go to a backup site, we have a backup site that we would be going to. The system runs on, that we have already, battery backup systems. We have generators here. The cars are on its own batteries. The portables are on its own batteries. So we do have a backup system. The system itself, as in the line or the, lack of a better word, I guess the signal will not come down because we will be at the level of public safety and that level cannot be interrupted. This consultant went above and beyond with regards to making sure that there's no interruption with our signals. Any interruption by outside would not be permitted. So our system will be robust and will ensure that the safety of all our members, officers, firemen, all our members within our employees will be able to have a robust system that will not break down. And that's where we need to be. The technology is always changing, and the system right now the new system will bring us where we need to be in the public safety sector.
Okay, thank you very much. I had another question. It's about the, since we're gonna have different departments dealing with this system, so are we sure that there will not be some interferences or some mismatch on the signal from different departments?
That's a very good question. Each department will be assigned a certain frequency, that frequency cannot come over on any other buddy's radio. So Cornwall Police will have their own radios, which is encrypted. Fire will have their own radios, Public Works, Transit, and so on. Can they still talk to each other? The capability is there, but it will not interfere when there is a certain situation going on for police or fire. It will not be permitted, and there's licensing for each specific channel, and those channels will not be able to skip over each other.
Okay, thank you. So I saw in the map here, I know the signal will get to United States, for example. Are we protected?
Absolutely. So the consultant has years of experience when dealing with border cities, and it's not unique. So ensuring that the licensing will not, as in the channels, will not be affected by any type of, it's like my time and your time, you would have some of that skip that would be coming over. That's not the case anymore, because all those are digital and the capability is not going to happen.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Bennett?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Acting Mayor. If I remember correctly from the first presentation a while back on this, the system we have now is to the point where repair and maintenance is becoming a bit of an issue. So would this, fair to say that this is more of a need to have as opposed to a nice to have?
It's definitely a need to have, and it will be a managed service. So meaning it's a leased equipment. So for the next 10 to 15 years, all updates will be provided depending on the RFP. Any radio breaks down, it'll be automatically replaced. So there's a major cost savings by going that direction of a managed service.
That's what I kind of remember hearing. Thank you.
Any more questions? If not, I have a quick comment. Need to have came out of both of you at the same time. I thought you were twins there for a minute. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your presentation. If I may, I'd like to get a mover and a seconder to receive the presentation. Councillor Bennett, Councillor Good, all in favor? Opposed? None?
And now we're also going to get a motion for the communication report on the same manner. And that recommendation is that council receive this report for information purposes.
Consent reports from one.
No, I need a mover and a seconder for the
Mover
motion.
and a seconder. Councillor McDonald, Councillor Ugundo. All in favor? I'll give you the consent report.
Yes, the consent reports. We have a few proclamations, and the first one is that council proclaim the month of March 2023 as Endometriosis Awareness Month in the city of Cornwall. That council proclaim the month of March 2023 as Multiple Myeloma Awareness Month in the city of Cornwall, and that council proclaim Thursday, February 2nd as Optimist Day in the city of Cornwall. Our next report is the Children's Services Business Practice Guidelines for 2023, with a recommendation that council approve the 2023 Children's Services Business Practice Guidelines to support the distribution of special purpose, general operating, and fee subsidy funding to operators that have a service contract with the City of Cornwall, as outlined in the background discussion of this report. The next one is OECM, Cooperative Purchasing, Information Technology Products and Services, with a recommendation that council delegate authority to the mayor and clerk to sign all documentation necessary to effectively complete client-supplier agreements for OECM marketplace IT-related products and services on an as-required basis, subject to requirements and budget availability. Tender 22 T47 Security Services, with a recommendation that this tender be awarded to Neptune Security Services from Mississauga at the total bid price of $586,600 $73.37 for a 3-year period, with an option to renew for an additional 2-year period. So one motion for all consent items, Mr. Mayor.
Motion, Hollingsworth, Counselor Good. All in favor? Okay, good. Now, resolutions, Madam Mayor.
We have none, Mr. Mayor.
None?
And we are looking for a motion to receive the unfinished business listing for January 23rd, 2023.
Counselor Bennett, Counselor McDonald, all in favor? Communication reports.
Non-competitive procurement, with a recommendation that council approve the non-competitive procurement for the ice plant maintenance and repair work at the Benson Center with Simcoe Refrigeration, a division of Toromont Industries Limited from Ottawa, Ontario, for a total of $197,525, excluding HST.
And the use of surveillance cameras.
We need a motion for the non-competitive procurement, Mr. Mayor?
May I have a motion, please? Counselor Hollingsworth, Counselor McIntosh, all in favor? Opposed? None?
Use of surveillance cameras on private property, with a recommendation that council receive this report and that no further action is required to regulate the use of surveillance camera on private
Questions? Okay, Counselor McDonald?
You need a motion first?
Yeah, I'm
Sorry.
getting her for a motion.
Okay.
She moved it.
Second.
Hollingsworth.
Okay, you wanna make a comment?
All in favor? Go ahead.
I guess this would probably be to you, Mr. Paul. So if I understand this correctly, if I have a camera and on my own property, and somehow, based on the angle of that camera, I am now looking at my neighbor's property, or even a portion of my neighbor's property, I am technically breaking this bylaw, correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I would ask Mr. Bray, who wrote the report.
Whoever wants to give it a
Yes.
whirl.
And is more familiar with the, matter. Yeah, that's.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. The present bylaw is a fortification bylaw. There is a section in there, and I underline the section in there. It is meant to, if you have any surveillance equipment, that it's limited to the perimeter of your property and should not extend past the property. So it is covered in that regards. Your question is whether you're breaking that bylaw or not. In essence, if you aren't, if you're going past the perimeter, then yes.
Okay, so, second question. Our bylaw officers are aware of that? They're aware of this provision in this bylaw?
This particular bylaw has not come up often. It would be something that we could look into had a case arises, but it's not a common bylaw.
Okay,
like
because
that we receive.
Just to give you some context, this started from a phone call from somebody who is exactly having this exact problem. So, when I call said person back, if their property is being filmed by their neighbors, the neighbor who is filming their property is breaking the bylaw, and they could call bylaw officers and say, this said neighbor has to move their camera. Is that making sense?
That would be the case as per the way the bylaw is written.
Okay, now, if an individual refused to change the angle of their camera and continued to film their neighbor's yard or part of their neighbor's yard, what happens next?
We would have to, if they don't abide by the order that they are received, then the next step would be prosecution.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bray.
Anyone else? No one else? New business motions, Madam Clerk.
We have none, Mr. Mayor, Acting Mayor.
Thank you. Bylaws?
Bylaws 2023-006 to 008 inclusive, listed on the agenda, are being presented to council for adoption.
Motion. Councillor Bennett. Councillor McDonald. All in favor? Reports?
Motion is carried. So reports from standing, advisory, special, and ad hoc committees of council.
Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Mayor. This is something that happened in December, but I don't believe we had the opportunity during council to recognize it. But Melissa Morgan, who is our Director of Human Services, which means that she's in charge of Ontario Works and in charge of housing and in charge of children's services, all human services, including housing. And we all think of her as the builder behind what's going on at 9th and McConnell. Well, Ms. Morgan was given a very prestigious award in December at the OMSA conference. That's the Ontario Municipal Social Services Association, yeah. She was given the Patty Moore Human Services Integration Award. And when she acknowledged the award and thanked everybody for having given it to her, she said that she deserved this award by virtue of the work done by her team. And one of those team members is here with us tonight. That's Christine Greaves. And I apologize for not having pulled it out of consent. I wanted to ask you a few questions about it because it's one of the most complex and dense departments, I'm sure. I can't imagine the size of the army you must have behind you to have produced that report and manage all that work. So I just want to say kudos and congratulations to Ms. Morgan, and thank you for recognizing your staff.
Congratulations to both of you. I know how much work you do and how many departments you're looking over. It's amazing what you do. At my age, I couldn't do the same thing as you guys are doing. And I don't think there are many people who deserve the congratulations that you two do. Thank you.
Yeah. If I can just add one more thing,
Sure, go
Mr.
ahead.
Acting Mayor.
Yep.
It's really important that in spite of the fact that these are huge departments and so much work that goes on, at the end of the day, what's important is improving the lives of people, and Ms. Morgan recognized that. And furthermore, improving the systems that assist people. And that's always a big challenge when you have systems as big as we do have in social services. So, thank you.
Thank you again. Notices of motion, Madam Clerk.
We have none, Mr. Acting Mayor.
None. Confirming bylaw.
So we are looking for a motion to adopt the confirming bylaw for this evening.
Motion. Councillor Bennett. Councillor Rundo. All in favor? Opposed? None.
And finally, Mr. Mayor, we need a motion for adjournment.
Before that. We need a motion for adjournment. I was going to say something, but that's fine. Next regular meeting is Monday, February 13th, 2023.
Is
Thank
that
you.
the family holiday day?
No, it's the next Monday, the 21st, I think it is.
Oh,
yeah.
Maybe the 20th?
Too late.
Yeah, I think the 20th.
I'm